We will start this module by understanding the concept of WTO. Until the end of 1994, there was no multilateral or international trade organization. Between 1947 and 1994, 8 rounds of negotiations took place underneath the aegis of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is known as GATT. The first 7 rounds concentrated on tariff reductions and commodity agreements. The last round, the Uruguay round, continued for 7 years from 1986 till 1994 and broadened the realm of discussion to include topics like tariffs, non-tariff measures, rules and services, intellectual property rights, dispute settlement, agriculture, textiles and clothing, etc. The Uruguay round of trade negotiations ended with the Marrakesh Agreement, founding the World Trade Organization known as WTO. In April 1994, 104 members became signatories to the agreement with minor changes in the original draft, and the final act came into force from January 1, 1995. Presently, the WTO membership has developed to 159 countries. The initiation of the WTO, a new international economic order for the world trade, has moved the focus of economic decision making from central political and economic constructs to the new integrated world. The formation of WTO has brought forward few challenges such as decline of tariff barriers and liberalization of trades in goods and services, etc. The WTO is not a mere expansion of GATT. It entirely substitutes GATT and has quite a different character. While GATT was functional on provisional basis, WTO commitments are full and permanent. Secondly, GATT enforces to trade in merchandise goods, whereas WTO covers a whole range of trade related issues. Finally, WTO is a stable organization with its own secretariat and its dispute settlement system. The purpose of WTO is stated clearly in the preamble and Article 2 of the agreement instituting the WTO. It is mentioned that the WTO intends to offer the common institutional structure for the conduct of trade relations between its members in subject relating to the agreements and related legal instruments comprised in the annexes to the agreements. After studying this module, you shall be able to understand the concept of WTO, to understand the impact on WTO on international trade, WTO and trade labor debate, the impact of WTO on agriculture, issues between WTO and India. WTO has following 5 functions as set out in Article 3. First, the WTO shall facilitate the implementation, administration and operations and further the objectives of this agreement and of the multilateral trade agreements, and shall also provide the framework for the implementation, administration and operation of plurilateral trade agreements. Second, the WTO shall provide the forum for negotiations among its members concerning their multilateral trade relations in matters dealt with under the agreements in the annexes to the agreement. Third, the WTO shall administer the understanding on rules and procedure governing the settlement of disputes. Fourth, the WTO shall administer the trade policy review mechanism. Fifth, with the view to achieve greater coherence in global policy making, the World Trade Organization shall cooperate as appropriate with IMF and with IBRD and its associated agencies. Let us now discuss the WTO and trade. WTO establishes a framework for trade policies. It has two chief constituents, the most favored nation, that is MFN, and the national treatment policy, that is NTP. Both are entrenched in the key WTO rules on goods, services and intellectual property, but their exact scope and nature vary across these areas. The MFN rule needs that a WTO fellow must apply the similar condition on all trade with other WTO members, that is, a WTO member has to endow the utmost favorable circumstances underneath which it consents trade in a specific product kind to all the other WTO members. Grant someone a special favor and you have to do the same for all the other WTO members. National treatment implies that imported goods must be dealt no less favorably than internally manufactured goods, at least after the foreign goods have entered the market, and was announced to handle non-tariff barriers to trade, for example, technical standards, security standards, et al., discriminating against imported goods. The principal legal agreements of the WTO trade treaty includes the General Agreement on Trade and Services, that is GATS, which provides a legal framework for trade in services defined to cover a range of areas including transport, investment, education, communication, financial services and the movement of persons. It calls for the negotiated advanced liberalization of regulations which obstruct trade and investment in services. GATS also provide a framework for the countries to choose sectors and subsectors that they will subject to principle of market access and national treatment and to place conditions for such access and treatment. The design of GATS stands out among the WTO agreements in several ways. For example, it includes both general disciplines that apply to all the service imports such as MFN treatment and specific sectoral measures that a government explicitly agrees to cover, like market entry and national conduct. The trade related aspects of intellectual property rights, which is known as TRIPS, that stands for TRIPS. TRIPS aims at establishing minimum standard of protecting rights over one's intellectual property, which comprises copyrights, trademarks, geographical signs, industrial plans, integrated circuits, patents and trade secrets. The aim is to balance innovation and distribution of technology to the common benefit of producers and users to promote social and economic welfare. This protection applies to both the product and the processes in all the technologies. Protection is available for 20 years for the patents and 50 years for copyrights. The economic rationale for protection of intellectual property stems from the market failure. Like other public goods, knowledge is non-rival and non-excludable, therefore it can lead to underproduction of knowledge in case of no intervention. The trade-related investment measures known as TRIM, that is TRIMS. TRIMS aims at eradicating the trade distorting consequences of investment measures taken by the WTO members. Policies such as local content necessities and trade balancing guidelines, which have been traditionally used to mutually encourage the interest of domestic industries and combat restraining business practices, are now banned. Measures precisely prescribed by the TRIMS agreement need not be excluded instantaneously, though such measures must be informed to the WTO within 90 days after the entry into the force of TRIMS. Developed countries will have a duration of 2 years in which to eliminate such measures. In principle, developing countries will have 5 years and least developed countries will have 7 years. Key reforms. There is an extensive faith that a multilateral trade rule governed by a comparatively young one country, one vote, member driven organization with a majority of developing country fellows has enormous potential for serious governance reforms. WTO's unique single undertaking mandate induces the governments to admit agreements as a comprehensive package instead of individual basis. While the mandate does provide some benefit to the developing countries, it is however argued that it has sharply reduced the flexibilities in choosing which agreement to sign, limiting their options for domestic development. The human development impact of such a mandate would be maximized if it confirmed that all countries' benefit were reflected in the trade regime's rules and regulations. Special and differential treatments can help achieve this goal. Formally, the WTO is supposed to be a democratic institution with global mandate. Hence, it should provide a distinctive opportunity to developing countries in case of a majority. However, such opportunities are tough to realize for the reason that informal consensus building having a far superior impact on WTO decision making than its formal processes. To this, experts have suggested changes to the consensus building process, such as allowing the countries without representatives to participate in decision making through video conferencing and other electronic data, as they may lead to better informed decisions. Central to the governance of the trade system is the WTO's dispute settlement mechanism, which is more time based, predictable, consistent and binding on all members over its predecessors under the GATT. However, here again, given the importance of trade sanctions and retaliations in the dispute settlement process, developing countries are in a weak position relative to the industrial countries. Proposals such as levying penalty payments and requiring financial compensations have been made to rectify the imbalance. Moving on to discuss WTO and agriculture. The Agreement on Agriculture, known as AOA. For the first time, agriculture was brought under the World Trading System in the Uruguay round of negotiations. Most valuations of the agreement barrage it as a remarkable move in the way it institutes new multilateral rules governing market entry, domestic support and export grants for the agricultural sector. In terms of future trade liberalization, its most significant provisions may be those needing the removal of quantitative trade restrictions, that is QTRs, and their transformation to sound tariffs. These sound tariffs, even though extremely high, can provide a starting point for future negotiations of tariff reduction. The AOA has 3 basic clauses. A. Market access commitment requires transformation of all non-tariff barriers into alike tariff barriers. Ordinary tariffs comprising those consequential form conversion of non-tariff barriers to the tariff barriers are to be decreased by an average of 36% with the minimum rate of reduction of 15% for each tariff over a 6-year period. Developing countries need to reduce tariff by 24% in 10 years. Developing countries which were retaining quantitative restrictions due to balance of payment problems were permitted to propose ceiling binding in place of tarification. It was also been specified that at least excess equal to 3% of the domestic consumption in 1986 to 88 should be recognized by the year 1995, rising to 5% at the end of the implementation period. B. Domestic support to agriculture was also to be abridged significantly in the countries where the average measure of upkeep surpassed the level specified in the member schedule. The limit for developed and developing countries was fixed at 5% and 10% of the total worth of agricultural output respectively. There are three types of support measures or subsidies that are not subject to decline under the agreement. They are as follows. First, green box measures, comprising of the policies that have minimum influence on the pattern of production and flow of trade. These include environment protection subsidies. Second is the blue box measures, which includes direct payments to the farmers for production limiting program and are pertinent only from the perspective of the developed countries. Third is the amber box measures, which are the most important measures from the point of view of producers in developing countries. The AOA demands commitment to reduce all these support measures by first quantifying them and then progressively reducing the domestic support, that is the aggregate measure of support known as AMS. C. Export subsidies are also to be reduced. The agreement encloses provisions regarding members' commitments to reduce the export subsidies. Developed countries need to decrease their export subsidies spending by 36% and the volume by 21% in 6 years in equal installments from 1986 to 1990 levels. For developing countries, the corresponding cuts are 24% and 14% in equal annual installments spread over the 10 years. At the last, the least developed countries are not conditional to any reduction commitment. Implication of AOA for Indian agriculture. The repercussions of WTO agreement and the elimination of quantitative restriction on imports are quite alarming. The fall in the prices of agricultural goods and dumping of cheap agricultural commodities from other countries is causing harm to the welfare of Indian farmers. Developed countries have imposed heavy tariffs to minimize imports, whereas in India tariffs are low. Due to this, various commodities are being dumped in India. The US is dumping 5 main farm commodities in the global market in clear violation of WTO agricultural rules. It is exporting corn, soya bean, wheat, rice and cotton at the prices far below their production cost in an effort to wipe out the global competition. The continuation of high domestic support to agriculture in developed countries is a cause of concern as they encourage overproduction in these countries, leading to low level of international prices of agricultural goods. Simultaneously, the rich industrialized countries continue to subsidize farmers by giving them direct payment which are exempt from any reduction requirements and which essentially are cash handouts contingent on making adjustment in production. These payments are neither affordable nor helpful in a developing country. The result is that the industrialized countries continue to dominate world trade in agriculture while preventing India and the other developing countries from achieving self-reliance in food production. The domestic support provision also affects India's food security. The agreement exempts government expenditures relating to the public stockholding for food security purposes from reduction requirement if the operation of such a program is transparent and follows officially published objective criteria. This automatically subjects these programs to external scrutiny. A developing country may acquire and release foodstuffs at the administered prices. However, the difference between the international market price and the administered prices will be included in the calculations of AMS. In this context, at the Bali Conference of December 2013, India successfully retained its program of agricultural subsidy. The export commitment requirements in turn prevent India from providing subsidies to the industries that are necessary for it to expand its share of world export market. Curb in the provision of subsidies will also adversely affect the future of Indian agriculture. The decrease in custom duties and non-tariff barriers as well as guaranteed minimum market share for imports will force the Indian farmers to contend against big transnational corporations which have excessive financial power resulting from their oligopolistic control over the world food markets. Indian farmers cannot contend on equivalent terms against the enormous financial and technological influence of the transnational giants of the rich countries, particularly when custom duties and other import barriers are reduced and these companies are guaranteed a share of Indian market. Acquiescence with market access will destroy the domestic food production and India will become dependent on the foreign food grains. To conclude, it is feared that the agreement is not favorable to India due to the following reasons. The country will be compelled to import minimum 3% of the domestic demand for agricultural products. The government will be forced to reduce subsidies to the farmers. The PDS and the public procurement system will have to be abandoned, directly affecting the survival of people below the poverty line. Let us now discuss WTO and labour. Trade-labour debate is the outcome of Heckscher-Ohlin-Samuelson model. Stopler and Samuelson, based on the model, argued about the impact of protective tariff on the relative earning of each factor of production. The protective tariffs on imported goods would increase their domestic prices and therefore would increase the real return to the scarce factor of production in the importing country and thus will reduce the real return to the factor in the abundant country. This hypothesis therefore defeats the utilization of cheap labour factor as a competitive advantage in international trade by developing countries including India. In Doha Ministerial Conference of WTO from 9th to 13th November of 2001, India had opposed the linkage between trade and labour standards. For developing countries, we all agree that wage differential is their major competitive advantage in international trade. Bearing a few knowledge and technology intensive segments where India has supremacy, India's international trade largely converges on this hypothesis, that is relatively cheap labour. Obviously, government is legitimate in protesting against such interventions of WTO that encompass labour and social issues. However, it has been argued that India in the long run needs to appreciate such requirements and improve the prevailing labour standards, yet can remain competitive internationally. Let us now examine why India needs to appreciate such requirements and improve the prevailing labour standards. The most widely used definition of core labour standards as found in the various conventions of the ILO encompasses following four main protections for workers. They include guarantee of right to organize and to bargain collectively, prohibition of forced labour, prohibition of child labour, prohibition of discrimination against different categories of workers on the basis of gender, ethnicity, etc. Indian trade unions are unanimously opposing any linkage between trade and labor standards in WTO. Fearing this would lead to massive loss of employment, which tantamount to violation of human rights. By now, it has been established that environment and labor will be used by the developed countries to raise the non-tariff barriers to protect their markets against export by developing countries. Despite a certain measure of achievements, India needs to improve upon in many areas and respects to enhance its quality of work life. Human development indicators put India much behind many other Asian countries. With the accession of China in WTO, India is required to concentrate on improving the efficiency and productivity in manufacturing and services without bothering for inclusion of labor standards in the future WTO negotiations. Relative competitiveness of India vis-a-vis other countries of the world put India much below other nations. Even in key management effectiveness measures among emerging Asian countries, India is way behind China and Malaysia. In terms of various additions per person in US dollar, China is much ahead of India. India has to bargain competitive strength through people with a ranking of 115 out of 162 countries in 2001 in terms of Human Development Index known as HDI. India is way behind many others in terms of HDI. Investment technology creation, raising the expenditure in research and development from present 0.7% of GNP, long healthy life, knowledge and decent standard of living, etc. should be the priority. With all the above initiatives, India can achieve supremacy and look beyond the present share of 0.7% in the global trade. By not agreeing to the enforcement of labor standards for the trade sanctions, India would indirectly create opportunities for the other developing countries including China who are way behind. Moving on to discuss some insights of WTO and India. It is also argued that sovereignty has to be trimmed if one wants advantages from the international organizations. It is true that all the international agreements set limits to the exercise of sovereignty of a country, but this limit must be voluntary and beneficial and not forced explicitly or implicitly. Further, the differences or discrepancies in the sovereignty to be enjoyed by members of the same organization should not be accepted as unavoidable. The US undoubtedly enjoys unrestricted sovereignty under the WTO as against the plight of the many developing countries. This was very clear when the panel on dispute settlement under the WTO gave certain verdicts. When Super 301 of the US was subject to dispute under the WTO, the panel accepted the explanation of the US that it will place administrative measures to ensure trade security or legal security. While in the case of India, when it is pledged for a similar approach, in the case of dispute on TRIPS, the panel argued that only amending the laws can satisfy the WTO's requirements. The concern shows in India by the various segments about the WTO are quite relevant and in fact necessary. One of the major reasons for this state of affair is the way in which the treaty making or accepting provisions are stated in the Indian Constitution. While there is a confusion on this score, by virtue of Article 253 of the Indian Constitution, the executive power of the unions extends to ratify international treaties and agreements. No law has been made in India regarding the manner in which the government shall sign or ratify international treaties, covenants, etc. Thus, the executive of the central government in India has the power to ratify the treaties. This practice is in contrast to the one prevailing in large number of developed and developing countries, where the treaties have to be ratified by the legislatures and in some areas by a 2/3 majority. Further, in some countries a referendum is required to ratify the international agreements that the governments enter into. The latter approach of ratification by the legislature indeed is superior to the one we have at present in India. This provision will provide Parliament and the public an opportunity to debate on various aspects of agreements and their implications. Thus, they become willing to the parties to any decision that is to be taken. The confusions, apprehensions and fears about the WTO stems from the lack of this required consensus. This situation is made worse by the extraordinary secrecy under which the government keeps all information. There is no transparency. In this context, the debate on India's membership of WTO is not only required, it is long overdue. This is the debate regarding the shrinking of policy space in the developing countries. The one-size-fits-all approach of the WTO agreements does not allow any space for the developing countries' governments to devise context-specific policies addressing their particular problem. As most WTO agreements are skewed in favor of the developed countries, lack of policy discretion on the part of developing countries' governments has implications for the social and the economic policy. Now, we will summarize what we have studied in this module. The Uruguay round of trade negotiations ended with the Marrakesh Agreement founding the World Trade Organization. The WTO establishes a common institutional framework for trade policies. It has two major components: the most favored nation rule and the national treatment policy. The principal legal agreement of WTO trade treaty includes GATS, TRIPS and TRIMS. Agreement on agricultural relates to the market access, reduction in the domestic support and export subsidies. Reduction of domestic support to agriculture has severe implication for food security in India. In Doha Ministerial Conference of WTO, India has opposed the linkage between trade and labour standards. Government is legitimate in protesting against such intervention of WTO that encompass labour and social issues. But in the long run, it needs to appreciate such requirement and improve the prevailing labour standards, yet can remain competitive internationally. The debate on India's membership of WTO is not only required, it is long overdue. This is the debate regarding the shrinking of policy space in the developing countries.